They laughed at his Matchbox trick until he took down 119 Germans in 4 days. January 1943. The landscape around WW2 Luki was covered in a thick layer of snow that had frozen into hard ridges under weeks of artillery fire and bitter wind. The front line, held by the Soviet 41st Guards Rifle Division, stretched across a series of shallow trenches hacked out of ground that no tool could penetrate deeply. Smoke lingered over the field from burned trees and collapsed bunkers. Small fragments of metal and uncollected bodies were buried beneath the drifts. Movement on the line had become limited to essential tasks only. Anyone who exposed themselves for more than a moment risked being hit by a German marksman who had been operating from concealed positions on the far tree line. In one of the forward pits, Ivan Korolev lay on his stomach, adjusting the cloth wrapped around the stock of his sniper rifle. He was 28 years old and came from Yaroslavl, where he had worked as a machinist in a textile mill before the war. He spent long hours repairing the internal components of looms so production lines would not stall. His supervisors often relied on him for the most delicate adjustments. When he was drafted in 1941, these same abilities were noticed by the regiment's marksmanship instructors. He had steady hands, a calm temperament, and patience to wait without losing focus. Those traits led him to sniper training, and by the time the fighting around WW2 Luki intensified, he had become one of the few remaining snipers in his unit. Several others had been killed or evacuated due to injury, leaving Ivan responsible for covering a large section of the forward approach. His task was clear: locate German observers, disrupt enemy reconnaissance, and prevent German infantry from advancing under cover of darkness or fog. Ammunition had grown scarce after repeated delays in supply shipments. Every round he had was counted and logged. He examined each cartridge for cracks from the cold before loading them into his pouches. He knew he could not afford waste. Even a single missed shot could reveal his location and force him to relocate under enemy fire. Inside the command dugout 30 meters behind him, Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Abramov leaned over a map spread across a crate. He was 35, older than most of the men in the company. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher in Smolensk. His calm, speaking manner remained, but months at the front had given his voice a rough edge. He oversaw the defensive sector and coordinated the remaining specialists, snipers, machine gunners, and scouts, so the line would not break under pressure. In recent days, he had grown increasingly concerned. Reports showed that German sharpshooters were moving closer under the cover of snowstorms. Their accuracy was improving. A Soviet sniper had been shot while cleaning his rifle, and another had been hit as he tried to crawl into a new position. Abramov had no replacements for them. Ivan was now the only sniper consistently operating on the forward line. Abramov explained the situation earlier that evening as Ivan and 2 scouts stood in the dugout doorway. German patrol activity had increased. Enemy officers were looking for weak points. If they found one, they would push quickly. The Soviets lacked the manpower to rotate fresh units into the trenches. Ivan listened closely, understanding the weight placed on him. Abramov concluded with a simple statement: "We cannot lose this ground. If they take the ridge, the entire left side will fold." After the briefing, Ivan crawled out to survey the field. The cold was intense, and the snow made a faint creaking sound under his elbows. The moonlight created a dim, flat illumination across the landscape, making it possible to see silhouettes but not details. Ivan moved slowly, stopping often, studying the long shadows where German firing points were likely concealed. He recorded small changes: tracks near a stump, a mound that had grown in height, and a faint reflection of glass that indicated a scope or binocular lens. He committed each detail to memory. While inspecting an abandoned trench section partly filled with snow, he found something unusual: a worn wooden matchbox, weathered and slightly swollen from moisture. He picked it up, turned it in his glove, and saw how it reflected a thin, sharp glint under the moonlight when angled slightly. It was nothing remarkable by itself, but Ivan paused and considered its effect at a distance. A small flicker of reflected light at the right moment could resemble the quick movement of a hand or sleeve. German marksmen had shown themselves to be reactive and aggressive. Any disturbance had drawn immediate fire over the past week. He brought the matchbox back to the dugout and examined it under the lantern. The edges were chipped. The surface caught light in unpredictable ways. He rotated it again and again, watching the reflection shift. The idea formed slowly, not as inspiration, but as a technical assessment. It might serve as a decoy. If he could create a controlled flash of light, it could draw fire from German snipers and reveal their firing points. With ammunition low, he needed a method that forced the enemy to expose themselves first. Abramov noticed Ivan studying the box and asked what he was doing. Ivan explained the concept in simple, practical terms, a decoy that could provoke enemy fire long enough for him to identify their location. Abramov stared at the box, unimpressed. He tapped the map with his finger. "We have serious problems, and you're thinking about a piece of wood." Ivan answered without raising his voice. "I only need one night to test it. If it fails, I will abandon it." The room fell quiet. Abramov eventually nodded. His resources were already stretched thin. Despite his doubts, he knew Ivan did not make careless suggestions. "Try it," he said, "but do not take unnecessary risks." Ivan pocketed the matchbox and returned to the firing pit. Snow drifted across the trench lip. The field ahead was quiet again, but he knew that German observers were still watching. Everything on this line depended on holding the ridge. Ivan adjusted his scope, checked the horizon one more time, and rested the matchbox beside him. The idea was simple. The conditions were harsh, but the next 4 days would show that this small object could change the entire balance of the sector. The temperature dropped further after nightfall, settling into the kind of cold that stiffened clothing and made every breath feel heavy. Ivan positioned himself inside a shallow snow pit he had reinforced earlier in the day with packed ice and broken planks. His rifle lay aligned with a narrow firing lane he had memorized during daylight. He placed the matchbox decoy on a small mound about 50 meters ahead, fixing it at an angle he had tested under the lantern. A thin wire, taken from a damaged signal reel, ran back to his position. With a careful pull, the matchbox would tilt slightly and catch the faint starlight. The front was quiet during the first hour. Occasional gusts of wind moved snow across the field and erased footprints almost as soon as they appeared. In the far distance, German voices carried through the still air, muffled and indistinct. Ivan remained motionless, his body pressed against the frozen ground, checking the horizon through the narrow opening in his cloak. He waited for a sign of activity. German sharpshooters usually became more active after 2200 hours, relying on darkness to mask their movement. At 22:14, Ivan gave a gentle pull on the wire. The matchbox shifted just enough to produce a quick flash. Less than 3 seconds later, a rifle shot cracked across the field. Snow kicked up from a mound where the matchbox sat. Ivan focused instantly, locating the origin of the muzzle flash. It had come from behind a low cluster of branches near the tree-line. He steadied his breathing, adjusted for distance, and fired once. The rifle report echoed cleanly. The German position fell silent. Ivan waited, not moving. He pulled the wire again, slower this time. Another flash from the matchbox. Another German shot followed, this one from farther left. He saw the brief reflection of a scope, raised his rifle a fraction of an inch, and squeezed the trigger. The field went quiet again. This pattern continued for nearly an hour. German shooters reacted quickly each time the matchbox flickered. Some fired from prone positions, others from angled snow berms they had built earlier. Ivan tracked each flash as precisely as he could. He fired only when he could confirm the exact point of origin. His aim remained steady despite the cold tightening his fingers. By midnight, he had counted multiple confirmed hits. He kept notes in a small, cloth-wrapped notebook, marking each shot, each direction, each estimated range. German behavior became more urgent as the night progressed. At one point, 3 rifles opened fire almost simultaneously at the same decoy flash, indicating that German units were communicating actively and believed they were engaging a Soviet sniper team rather than a simple wooden box. The bombardment of decoy fire gave Ivan several additional targets. He identified a German observer crawling between two branches, illuminated briefly by the moonlight. He struck him with a measured shot. Another target appeared when a machine gun assistant shifted position slightly to adjust belt feed. The reflection from his metal tool gave him away. Ivan hit him as well. Inside the Soviet trenches, scouts kept track of the firing sounds and observed faint silhouettes through field binoculars. When the firing finally died down, close to 3 o'clock, they whispered to each other about the number of enemy shots they had counted. The frequency indicated a tense German reaction. None of the scouts understood how Ivan was provoking such intense enemy fire until he returned to the trench shortly before dawn. At first light, Soviet patrols crawled forward to confirm results. A thin mist rose from the ground, revealing several German bodies spread across the open field near their firing points. The scouts examined entry wounds and marked distances. They returned to the dugout with their findings, and Abramov listened without speaking. When they finished, one scout added quietly that all the shots came from the same direction, the direction of Ivan's pit. Abramov finally looked at Ivan. The officer's skeptical expression from the night before had disappeared. The tone in the dugout shifted. Men who had dismissed the Matchbox idea now understood its effect. No one laughed or used the word lightly anymore. They studied the simple object placed on the table as if it were a piece of unfamiliar equipment. Ivan said little. He knew that the Germans, having taken losses during the night, would not repeat their mistakes. They would adjust quickly. They would deploy more sharpshooters. They would test new angles of fire. That meant he needed to prepare before nightfall. He left the dugout as the morning light grew stronger. The air remained bitterly cold, and the snow reflected a harsh brightness that made visibility difficult. He examined the field again, searching for signs of German reaction. The enemy would not allow such losses to continue. He returned to his pit and began planning the next step. The first night had proven the Matchbox could work. The challenge now was to stay ahead of whatever the Germans would try next. By the second morning, the Germans had already begun adjusting to the losses from the night before. Their sharpshooters changed angles, shifting to secondary positions farther back in the tree line. Small mounds of recently turned snow showed that new firing points had been dug. From a distance, Ivan noticed subtle differences: slightly wider fields of fire, tightened spacing between their nests, and a pattern of small test shots aimed toward likely Soviet observation points. The Germans were searching for him deliberately now, not reacting blindly as before. Ivan spent the daylight hours studying these new positions through narrow slits cut into the snow wall around his firing pit. Whenever a German sniper tested a shot, he watched how the snow beneath the muzzle displaced. He took note of tree branches that shifted slightly after each recoil. He tightened his hood against the cold and pressed his cheek to the stock of his rifle, careful not to fog the scope lens. By early afternoon, he realized that the Germans had started using decoys of their own. At least two shapes near the tree line appeared to be helmets mounted on sticks, positioned at shoulder height. Their purpose was obvious: provoke Soviet fire and identify where it came from. Ivan did not shoot. Instead, he watched how the helmets moved, how they were raised and lowered, and how enemy sharpshooters reacted when nothing happened. The Germans were becoming cautious. That same afternoon, Ivan prepared new elements for his deception. He found a broken shovel blade partially buried in frozen mud behind the trench. He hammered it gently until it formed a slight reflective surface. The metal caught light differently from the matchbox, producing a brighter, more defined flash. He tied it to a second wire and positioned it on a low mound of snow, angled higher than the original decoy. The idea was to create variation: one decoy close to the ground, another slightly elevated, each triggering a different German response. If the enemy believed multiple snipers were operating, they might reveal more firing points. When night arrived, temperatures dropped again. A thin layer of frost formed on the edges of Ivan's rifle. He crawled back into position and waited. The field felt unusually still. German movement had become quieter and more deliberate. Ivan could sense their increased caution. He triggered the lower matchbox decoy first. This time, Only one German rifle fired, and the shooter quickly relocated. Ivan identified the flash, but did not fire immediately, waiting for confirmation. After a few minutes, the same rifle fired a second time from a slightly shifted angle. Ivan exhaled slowly and struck the target with one precise round. He then triggered the higher decoy made from the shovel blade. The reflection it produced was sharper, and it drew attention immediately. Two German rifles fired at the same time. Both flashes appeared close together, indicating a pair of shooters operating side by side. Ivan adjusted his scope and struck the one on the right first. The second rifle fired again, but its muzzle flash gave away the exact position. He fired a second shot, ending the engagement. He continued this method throughout the night, alternating between the two decoys and waiting for each German sniper to commit. He avoided using the same wire pattern twice. The randomness made it harder for the enemy to predict his timing. The Germans became more desperate. One group attempted to crawl forward under cover of darkness to identify the decoy positions directly. Their movement created faint depressions in the snow that Ivan tracked. He waited until one soldier lifted his head briefly above a ridge. The silhouette was enough. Ivan fired once, and the movement stopped. Another soldier attempted to drag the body back, exposing himself in the process. Ivan struck him as well. After that, German crawlers retreated, likely realizing they were being monitored closely. Around midnight, German machine gun fire erupted unexpectedly from a flank position that had remained silent for days. The gunners swept the area where the decoys were placed, attempting to destroy them. Ivan did not respond immediately. Instead, he followed the arc of the tracer rounds and pinpointed the muzzle of the weapon. The machine gunner paused to adjust the belt. That brief interruption provided Ivan the fraction of a second he needed. He fired, and the machine gun fell silent. Hours later, scouts crawled into Ivan's pit to deliver an update. They had been tracking sounds and flashes carefully, and their reports aligned with Ivan's notebook entries. At least 7 confirmed enemy casualties were accounted for by early dawn, with several more likely but unconfirmed. The scouts told him that German radio traffic, intercepted earlier, indicated growing frustration among their officers. They were convinced a coordinated Soviet sniper detachment was hidden somewhere along the ridge. Ivan continued working until nearly dawn, adjusting his decoys and repositioning slightly to avoid counterdetection. He recorded each engagement in his notebook, noting the angles, the distances, and the sequence of events. His handwriting had grown tight and small due to the cold, but the details were clear. When morning finally came, the sky brightened to a pale gray. German activity slowed as visibility improved. Their sharpshooters withdrew deeper into the tree-line to avoid being spotted. Ivan remained in position, watching them retreat. He understood that the next night would be more challenging. The enemy had already shown signs of adapting. They would not fall for the same patterns again. He returned to the dugout for a brief rest. Abramov studied him carefully. The officer now realized that Ivan's work was shaping the entire battlefield dynamic. The constant pressure on German sharpshooters was preventing them from targeting Soviet officers, machine gun crews, and forward observers. It was holding the line together. Ivan warmed his hands over a small stove before preparing to go back out. He knew the coming night would be harder. The Germans were searching for him now with more determination than before. He had to stay ahead of them to keep the advantage. The third night was approaching, and both sides understood that it would determine control of the sector. The third day began with a heavy silence across the front. Snowflakes drifted in slow, uneven patterns, but the air felt dense and still. The Germans had reduced their daytime activity, and the lack of rifle fire suggested they were preparing for a different approach. Ivan used the relative quiet to reinforce his firing pit, packing more snow along the edges to absorb incoming rounds. His hands shook from the cold as he worked, but he made steady progress. He understood that the Germans were adapting quickly, and his position had to be stronger than before. By mid-morning, the first signs of their new tactics appeared. German observers began testing the line with isolated shots aimed at random points across the Soviet trenches. Each round struck the snow with a sharp thud, not intended to hit a target, but to elicit a reaction. German sharpshooters were listening for any answering fire, trying to isolate where the Soviet sniper might be operating. Ivan remained still and silent, never responding. He watched the field through a small slit in the snow wall, tracking each shot to see where the muzzle flashes originated. Several had moved since the night before. The Germans escalated their efforts around midday. A brief burst of machine gun fire came from a concealed flank position, sweeping the edge of the Soviet trench system. Soviet infantry ducked instinctively, but no casualties were reported. The pattern made the intention clear. They were probing, testing, searching for Ivan. The enemy had lost too many men in the previous nights and were now determined to identify the source of the threat. Ivan prepared for the coming night with more caution than before. He added a third element to his decoy setup, a broken piece of Soviet greatcoat he had cut from a damaged uniform. He tied it to a thin stick and placed it at a shallow angle so that, when moved by the wire, it would resemble a shifting sleeve or shoulder. The Germans had already familiarized themselves with the flashes from the matchbox and the shovel blade. The cloth would break that pattern. Evening came earlier than usual as clouds gathered overhead. By the time darkness settled, the field had taken on a dim, flat tone that made it difficult to distinguish between snow mounds and terrain features. Ivan crawled into position and tested each decoy. One pull for the matchbox, two slow pulls for the shovel blade, and a short tug for the cloth figure. Each produced a slightly different movement. These subtle variations were important. The Germans would not fall for repetition. The first enemy movement came just after 2000 hours. A German engineer team attempted to crawl forward along a low ridge, using the terrain as cover. Ivan tracked their movement through his scope, noting how their bodies created faint depressions in the snow. He waited until one of them lifted his head to scan the Soviet line. The silhouette was small, but clear enough. Ivan fired once. The man fell without a sound. The other two crawlers stopped immediately, unsure of what had happened. When one of them shifted to pull the body back, Ivan struck again. The remaining soldier retreated quickly, disappearing behind a ridge. An hour later, the Germans launched a more coordinated effort. A team of riflemen fired in controlled bursts toward the area where the decoys were placed. The shots struck the snow around them, sending small clouds into the air. Ivan stayed low, studying the pattern of fire. He triggered the shovel blade decoy. A German rifleman responded instantly. Ivan located the flash and fired a single round. The German fell backward into his trench. Within minutes, a machine gun team opened fire from farther back in the tree. Their weapon cut across the area in wide arcs. Ivan watched their firing cycle carefully. When the gun paused so the assistant could adjust the ammunition belt, he fired at the brief silhouette that appeared behind the weapon. The machine gun stopped immediately. German frustration was becoming evident. Instead of withdrawing, they increased their activity. At one point, a German sniper fired 3 rapid shots at the cloth decoy, believing he had finally caught movement from a real Soviet sniper. Ivan waited for the shooter to shift his position, as they often did after firing multiple rounds. When the German repositioned slightly to improve his angle, his rifle barrel moved beyond the edge of a stump. Ivan fired, hitting him cleanly. Snow began falling again around midnight, making visibility worse. This favored Ivan, but it also limited his view of deeper German firing points. He adjusted his focus, relying more on sound. Each German shot had a distinct tone depending on distance and angle. Ivan used those variations to guide his rifle. Throughout the night, he recorded each engagement in his notebook. The pages had grown stiff and slightly damp, but he continued writing with steady precision. When scouts arrived near dawn with additional field reports, they confirmed at least 29 German casualties from the night's fighting. Several more were suspected, but unconfirmed due to the limited visibility. Abramov reviewed the reports and looked at the men in the dugout. They understood now that Ivan's work was not simply reducing enemy numbers. it was dismantling German confidence. Their sharpshooters were losing ground. Their patrols were afraid to advance. Their machine gun crews were becoming hesitant. The line had strengthened not through reinforcements, but through the disruption created by one man and a handful of improvised tools. Ivan remained aware that the Germans would not accept this situation much longer. They had already changed tactics twice. They would change them again. He would need to anticipate their next move. The night had ended, but the challenge ahead was only growing sharper. The fourth day began with a thick fog rolling in from the river. It settled low over the frozen ground, covering the entire field in a pale, shifting haze. Visibility dropped to only a few dozen meters, and the familiar outlines of the tree line blurred into a single gray mass. The fog muffled sound, making it difficult to tell where movement was coming from. For both sides, it created uncertainty. But for Ivan, it also offered concealment he had not yet been able to use. He spent the early hours reinforcing his pit again, packing snow around the edges and clearing a narrow firing slot through which he could still track faint shapes. The matchbox and the shovel blade decoy lay ready beside him. The piece of cloth tied to the stick was stiff with ice, but it would still move when pulled. He checked each wire twice to ensure it would not freeze in place. His rifle was cleaned, oiled lightly, and covered until needed. The fog meant he had to rely on sound and small hints of movement rather than clear visuals. By mid-morning, Soviet scouts whispered that German troops had begun gathering beyond the tree line. The fog concealed them, but muffled footsteps and the occasional metallic clink revealed their presence. Abramov suspected a large assault was imminent. German commanders would not allow 3 nights of losses without a decisive response. If they broke through the ridge, the Soviet line would fold on both flanks. Ivan understood his role clearly: slow the assault long enough for the Soviet infantry and machine gun crews to hold the defensive positions. The first movement came around noon. Dark figures emerged in the fog, moving cautiously, rifles held low. German infantry squads advanced in small groups, using the thick haze as cover. Ivan steadied his breathing and scanned for movement patterns. A squad climbed onto a small rise in the terrain, unaware that the fog behind them made their silhouettes stand out faintly against the lighter background. Ivan waited for the clearest shot and fired. One soldier dropped instantly. The squad froze, unsure of the shot's origin. When another soldier attempted to drag the body back, Ivan struck again. The squad retreated into the fog. Minutes later, German sharpshooters opened fire toward Ivan's section of the line. Their shots appeared without warning, flashes muted by the haze. Ivan could not see them clearly, but he could determine their approximate location by the short delay between muzzle blast and bullet impact. He adjusted his aim accordingly. When a German shooter fired a second shot, Ivan caught the faint movement of a rifle barrel emerging from behind a snow mound. He fired once, ending the threat. The pressure increased as afternoon approached. German troops began advancing from multiple angles simultaneously. Their officers were attempting to overwhelm the Soviet line through coordinated attacks rather than isolated probes. Machine gun teams fired in short bursts, covering infantry movement. Mortar rounds landed sporadically behind the Soviet trenches, shaking loose snow from overhead logs. The assault was designed to force confusion and panic. Ivan triggered the matchbox decoy. A German rifleman fired immediately at the flicker. Ivan tracked the faint silhouette that followed and struck him. He then triggered the cloth decoy. 2 German riflemen fired almost simultaneously. Their muzzle flashes were brief, but visible through the fog. Ivan fired in quick succession, hitting both targets. He shifted his position slightly afterward to avoid enemy counterfire. As the assault intensified, the fog worked in Ivan's favor. German infantry movements became less coordinated. Officers struggled to maintain formation. Groups of soldiers emerged unexpectedly from the haze, often unaware of their exact location. When one squad approached dangerously close to the Soviet trenches, Ivan switched focus. He tracked them carefully as they moved over uneven ground. When the lead soldier raised his rifle, Ivan shot him through the chest. The squad hesitated, confused about where the fire was coming from. Ivan took another shot, stopping a second soldier. The remaining men withdrew, abandoning the push. Around mid-afternoon, a German machine gun team set up behind a low ridge. The sound of the weapon cutting through the fog was heavy and controlled. Its round struck the snow just meters from Ivan's position. He listened carefully for the timing of the firing cycle. When the gunner paused to adjust his position, Ivan fired at the barely visible outline. The weapon stopped. The assistant attempted to continue the attack, but exposed his arm briefly while repositioning. Ivan struck him as well. The continuous engagements strained Ivan physically. His muscles tightened from the cold, and the fog soaked into his clothing. But he stayed focused, monitoring every sound and flash. He understood that if he faltered, the German assault could break through the line. Just before evening, the fog thickened further, turning the battlefield into a featureless gray corridor. German radio signals could be heard faintly as officers attempted to regroup. Their assault had slowed. Their casualties had mounted. Their confidence was deteriorating. Ivan knew they were preparing for one final attempt. He remained ready. When the last wave came, it was smaller and less coordinated than the earlier pushes. Groups of German infantry moved hesitantly, firing into the fog without clear targets. Ivan used the confusion to strike any soldier who presented a clear silhouette or muzzle flash. One by one, these groups withdrew, leaving behind scattered shapes that gradually faded into the haze. As night replaced the fog, the field grew quiet. No more German shots followed. Scouts crawled forward to assess damage and returned with detailed reports. The German assault had collapsed entirely, halted by steady Soviet rifle fire and the disruption created by Ivan's precision work. They estimated that Ivan had accounted for more than 40 enemy casualties throughout the day, bringing his total across the 4-day period to 119 confirmed hits. When Ivan finally returned to the dugout, he was exhausted. His coat was soaked, his hands were stiff, and his rifle barrel was cold enough to leave frost on his gloves. Abramov met him at the entrance. The officer examined him silently, recognizing the effort required to hold the line that day. Ivan removed the matchbox from his pocket and set on the table. It was chipped, wet, and nearly falling apart, but it had worked. It had bought time. It had protected the line. The men in the dugout understood. Without a speech, without ceremony, they knew what Ivan had accomplished. The fog began to lift overnight, revealing a field marked by scattered equipment, collapsed firing positions, and the faint outlines of men who had fallen during the previous day's fighting. As the light grew stronger, the air turned colder, settling the snow into a smooth surface that concealed the violence that had occurred only hours earlier. Soviet patrols moved cautiously across the field, documenting German positions and retrieving anything that could be reused. The enemy had withdrawn during the night, pulling back toward the deeper forest line to reorganize. Ivan sat inside the dugout, warming his hands over a small stove. His clothing was still damp, and patches of frost clung to the fabric. The exhaustion from 4 days of fighting weighed heavily on him. Each engagement had required careful observation, precise timing, and an unbroken focus. And by the end of the 4th day, he had reached the limits of physical endurance. Despite this, he listened attentively as Abramov reviewed the latest reports. According to intercepted radio transmissions and field reconnaissance, German commanders had ordered a temporary halt to offensive operations in the sector. They needed time to regroup, replenish their sharpshooter units, and re-evaluate their plan. Their forward positions had been significantly disrupted, and the losses over the last 4 days had forced them to reconsider their approach. For the first time since late December, the Soviet line experienced several hours of uninterrupted quiet. In the days that followed, the wider battle around WW2 Luki continued. Soviet forces intensified their pressure on the encircled German garrison inside the city. Artillery fire echoed constantly in the distance. Fresh units arrived to reinforce the main assault, while German troops attempted to break out of the pocket. The fighting elsewhere was fierce and chaotic, But on Ivan's section of the line, the intensity had diminished noticeably. The enemy rarely approached at night. Their sharpshooters fired far less often. Even their attempts at probing attacks became cautious and infrequent. Many Soviet soldiers in the trenches understood the reason. The Germans had been forced into a defensive posture after losing too many forward observers, riflemen, and machine gun crews to a single marksman they had not been able to locate. The matchbox trick and the variations Ivan had added to mask his position had convinced German officers that a coordinated sniper detachment was operating along the ridge. This miscalculation disrupted their planning and forced them to move more slowly than before. Despite the clear impact of his work, Ivan received little formal recognition. The regiment was overwhelmed with administrative tasks during the larger operation, and paperwork often went missing. Reports were handwritten by officers under freezing conditions, then carried by runners who sometimes never reached their destinations. Abramov wrote a commendation describing Ivan's actions, but it disappeared somewhere between the field headquarters and the divisional command. Such losses were common during the winter campaigns. Inside the dugout, Ivan stored his rifle carefully and replaced the cloth wrap around the stock. Frostbite had begun affecting the fingertips of his left hand, making fine movements painful. The medical orderly inspected him briefly and recommended he rest for several days. But Ivan knew the line could not afford to lose another sniper. He returned to his position as soon as the weather allowed. The matchbox itself did not last long, though it softened from moisture and eventually split. Someone might have taken it as a keepsake, or it might have been discarded during a later trench clearing. No one could say for certain, but the idea it represented remained clear in the minds of those who had watched Ivan work. In the weeks after the battle, the Soviet push around WW2 succeeded. The German garrison inside the city was destroyed, and the surrounding territory returned to Soviet control. When investigators and field officers reviewed captured German documents, they found several references to an unknown Soviet sniper unit responsible for heavy losses along the northern ridge. The Germans had never learned that their assessment was incorrect. Ivan continued to serve on the front for the remainder of the war. His responsibilities changed as new recruits arrived and fresh equipment was supplied, but the memory of those 4 days stayed with him. He kept his small notebook with detailed entries of each engagement. The writing inside was cramped and sometimes smudged, but the numbers and distances remained precise. It was one of the few records that survived to describe what had happened on the ridge. For most people, the events along that snow-covered stretch of ground became a minor entry in a much larger campaign. Millions of soldiers fought across the Eastern Front, and countless individual actions were never recorded. But for the men who had held the ridge, the difference was unmistakable. Without the disruption caused by Ivan's work, German sharpshooters and reconnaissance teams could have targeted Soviet officers, destroyed machine gun nests, or marked positions for artillery. The entire sector might have collapsed under a coordinated assault. Instead, the line held. The surviving soldiers remembered that the turning point did not come from reinforcements or new equipment. It came from a small, improvised idea that forced the enemy to hesitate. A simple object combined with observation, patience, and discipline had shifted the balance at a critical moment. Ivan never presented himself as a hero. He viewed his actions as part of a larger duty shared by every soldier on the ridge. But those who were there understood what he had done. They spread the story quietly, without exaggeration, describing how a matchbox, something normally insignificant, had become the center of a 4-day struggle that shaped the outcome of their defense. As the winter dragged on and new battles began, the memory of that moment faded into the background. Yet for those who survived, it remained proof that on a front defined by vast armies and massive offensives, sometimes the survival of an entire position depended on a single man who refused to yield.